Thanks for joining us on Coast to Coast Pest Talk.
Welcome, everybody, to Coast Pest Talk. I'm your host, Andy Sanefski, and I have Alex Wade from England today, not Gabe. Alex, welcome.
Hey, how you doing? Yes, it's an honor to be back on again. I thoroughly enjoyed the last time, and yes, congratulations, I think, in order, aren't they, to Gabe?
Oh, my goodness, yeah, for sure. I guess unexpectedly early, they had their sixth child. So Gabe is going to be out for a while, and Alex was kind enough to say, I'll jump in and guest host as well. So thank you for that, Alex.
I mean, literally, I think I'd already said yes before you'd finished saying the sentence. I mean, absolutely love these podcasts. And when you told me what we're going to be talking about as well, I could absolutely not turn this one aside, because this is something that I think, yeah, well, let's use that. I get super nerdy about. I really enjoy talking about this kind of thing. So do you want to introduce what it is?
You go ahead. You're on a roll. Go ahead and tell them what we're going to be talking about.
We're going to be talking about behavioral resistance in house mice specifically, which is something that is becoming, certainly over in the UK, we've known about it for a long time. There were some studies done in Birmingham and in Ali Pali in London. And it's always been something that's been rumbling away in the background and never really given that much thought. We've had a lot more lens on the other forms of resistance, the resistance to chemical compounds, the resistance, all of those physiological resistances as opposed to behavioral resistances.
Yeah, for sure. I always say they're the sexy resistances.
Because you get to use science equipment and microscopes and HPLCs and yeah.
That's right. Now, and actually, this is an interesting topic because today is the first day of a new era in British pest control, right? Today, you guys have the glue board change goes into effect.
Oh, yes. We've got a lot of changes coming up.
Yeah.
We have a lot of really weird changes coming up, actually.
Oh,
so don't. I'm not going to go too far into the glue board licensing because it's been somewhat of a palaver. And as you may or may not know, and as your listeners may or may not know, the UK is very strange in the sense that we don't have licensing for pest controllers. Pest controllers aren't licensed. We will sit qualifications. So we have several qualifications, all of various names that allow you to do various things and bits and bobs, but there is no formal license. It is theoretically harder to become a bouncer doorman in the UK than it is to become a pest manager, which is a thought, isn't it?
My goodness.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. That's not to diminish what we do as the pest management community, but it's been a bit of a strange one in our ranks for a while that we haven't got any kind of formalized licensing. So the fact that we have a product which is now licensed is a strange one, because the products are becoming licensed, but the technicians and the applicators are not. Simply their competence is weighed on the courses they've undertaken and the qualifications they hold. So we are vetted on our competence through qualification, and the products appear to be becoming more and more regulated, which is a strange way of doing it. But yeah, today marks the first day. And tell me if you think this is absolutely crazy, and you'll probably be in alignment with many others in the UK. But at the moment, in order to use a glue board, it's licensed. It's a bit, it's an act, no longer a bill. It's moved to an act of law. And with that, we can only use them in very specific places. And the original enactment said that the only places you could use them were aircraft, not aircraft hangars, aircraft, hospital wards, not hospitals, just the wards, and structures of national importance. So the assumption being power stations, which you don't necessarily want a mouse to chew through a cable and us to go, thermonuclear on a whim. But originally, those were the only three places that the government was prepared to allow us to use glue boards. And after a lot of lobbying, after a lot of conversations with the trade associations and government, we managed to get food premises put back on the list, which arguably is the place where we use the majority of glue boards. But even then, there is the licensing fees are astronomical. A class license is several £100s. A one-off use license, so if you have to apply for an emergency use license of a glue board, it's £500 that's about, I think in conversion rates, that's going to be between close to $600. I know, $600 to use a glue board on one occasion, or a spread of glue boards on a single occasion.
Oh
It
my
has
goodness.
made the use of glue boards, to all intents and purposes, untenable for the
Yeah.
majority of the pest management community in the UK,
Yeah.
until we redefine this. And to bring this back around to kind of what we're talking about, resistances. So I'm not sure if you're aware, or I told you before. So with my previous role, I used to sit on the Rodenticide Resistance Action Committee in Europe. And that was run by an organization called CropLife, and they brought in all of the manufacturers and developers and users of rodenticides to send their technical people into a big room where we would discuss the science and the spread of resistances throughout Europe. I then moved on to the RRAG, which is the Rodenticide Resistance Action Group in the UK, and that is solely scientist volunteers and technical people who organize studies, analyze the data, and then advise everyone else on what's been going on. So I have a fairly good capture of the chemical mechanisms of resistance. But still, in both of those organizations, for the 10 years or so that I've been involved with both of them, behavior resistance has been, isn't that interesting?
Mm.
So, onto the L120Q mutation.
Yeah.
It's so overlooked, but it's becoming more and more and more of a thing.
It
So,
really is. And so was that part of I know in Europe they have, it seems like you guys have done a much better job at tracking resistance and actually like describing and naming strains, genetic
yeah,
strains that have resistance to certain active ingredients, where it seems like we're kind of flat-footed here. We don't really have that sort of
you
depth of
can get involved in this if
mm,
you so wish. I have no doubt that the RRAC, the Rodenticide Resistance Action Committee, which is a global initiative but focused mainly on Europe, but they also run the IRAC and the FRAC,
yeah,
the insecticide and the
right.
fungicide and the herbicides. I think we drew the short straw with RRAG, to be fair. The others sound a lot cooler. But with that, we have, as you say, limited data. We have for years been sending tail samples
Mm,
from across Europe to a spread of labs through the UK and Europe looking for these resistances. And so far, we've established there to be 9 SMP, so single nucleotide polypeptides, which confer a resistance to one or more of the 5 second generation anticoagulants that we commonly use globally. And overwhelmingly, the resistances occur to difenacum and bromadiolone. There's
mm,
been anecdotal evidence of resistance to diphenthylone in house mice. There is a increased tolerance to the single feeds, but certainly not a resistance to them, unless you believe some of the reports coming out of Barcelona at the last UKIP, where house mice are showing a resistance for difenacum. But long story short, we've identified this, and if your listeners are listening, and if you want after this, go and type into Google, Bing, other search engines are available, the Rodenticide Resistance Action Committee. Have a look at that and bring up, they have an interactive map. So you can
yeah,
basically go anywhere in the world, you can bring the map up, you can put in your location, and it will do a spread. And if anyone has reported resistance in your area, which probably is unlikely in North America, but go and have a look at Europe just for a bit
yep.
of fun, you can see the spread of resistance. And if you like, you can actually do it over time as well. So you can see these resistance loci migrating around. The UK is a really good one because we've had good surveillance for like 10 years.
Yeah.
But basically you can see these, well, longer than that actually, because the first generation resistance was located in Scotland to warfarin in 1960. So we've been on following this for a little while. But the resistance spread is phenomenal. It's something like between 3 to 5 miles a year it moves.
Oh
So over
wow.
the course of 20 years, it's moved far enough that actually it is most of the UK now has one, if not more, resistances. And the really fascinating thing is, and I'm so sorry, I've gone on a
No, no.
nerd tangent straight away,
I love it.
is we're starting to see hybridized resistances coming in. So in some places you're seeing like a homozygous resistance loci, but in other locations you're seeing heterozygous, like let's say L120Q, and at the same time you're also seeing the loci for 128 S or F, I can't remember what it is, but you're seeing 2 loci in the same animal, which previously it doesn't really work, because if you damage an enzyme sufficiently, it's just going to stop working. But apparently there are a couple of resistance loci, a couple of these SMPs that are not self-eliminatory. They don't outcompete each other, and so you're not just getting a resistant animal, you're getting an animal which potentially is really, really going to start causing troubles later on. So yeah, resistance is fascinating, but as I
It
say,
really is.
behavior resistance.
Yeah, and I have been on there and to look, and you can see parts of Germany, bromadiolone resistance here, and France has this, and really drill it down. But then when you look at North America, it's like, oh no, we have no resistance problems here. But I know for a fact we've run into resistance issues, personally here in our work. So it's definitely here.
Oh,
We
it
just
would
don't
be
track it.
so fascinating to start a surveillance program, and I would happily wade in and, pardon the pun, get. Sorry, for those who can't see my full name, I'm Alex Wade. So any kind of Wade pun is I've lived with that all of my life.
Perfect.
But with that, getting involved with something like that would be phenomenal, especially considering the availability now of alternatives to SCARs. SCARs definitely and will always have a place, but we really have, we've got a couple of alternatives coming. Cholecalciferol being probably one of the most widely known and accepted. And it works on a different mode of action. So suddenly a lot of these resistances that we're seeing, we have an alternative. However, to bring us back round again, and I'm desperately trying to do it, changing an active material won't necessarily combat behavioral resistance.
Yeah, doesn't solve the problem. So now, how would you separate, say, a behavioral resistance from like a metabolic resistance? What's the delineation? How are they different for our listeners?
Well, I was about to say there's a genetic element to it. One's orientated by your genes, but actually there have been some studies done in the UK in areas of Birmingham and areas of London, as I said before, where there's a behavioral resistance where mice will not consume anything with the carbohydrates in it. And this is not a behavior that is a learned behavior or an innate behavior. This is actually a physiological behavior, because the animals have basically lost the ability to produce the enzyme amylase, which usually is found in our saliva and our gut. It's what breaks down long and complicated carbohydrates into the shorter chain carbohydrates, which we are available used for energy. And it means that because they're unable to produce amylase, they can't make use of these complex carbohydrates that we find in wheat. So what is rat bait without wheat at the end of the day? Name me a rodenticide that does not contain wheat or wheat flour or carbohydrates. I will wait. Vanishingly few.
Is that similar then to what we see with roaches, where they'll have glucose aversion after being exposed to bait formulations with high glucose levels over time?
Yes, and so this is they avoid carbohydrate because they can't digest it. But you've kind of hit the nail on the head, which is true behavioral resistance falls, in my opinion, into two camps. There is the learnt resistance. There's the learnt resistance. I've encountered something, I did not like it. Barry over there encountered something, and now he's on the floor screaming and turning in circles. Let's not do what Barry did, guys. That seems like a bad show. So there's a learned resistance, and that can either be by the individual or by the population. And then there's like innate behavior resistances, which is where the animal already has a predisposition to a certain behavior. And that's quite hard to get your head around, because that's like generational trauma, let's say. That's like moving across. But we see it all the time, and we see it every single day. Can you guess where? We see it with brown rats more than anything else.
Oh, yeah.
Neophobia.
Yeah.
Neophobia is a form of behavioral resistance. It's altering the animal's normal behavior in a way that is resistant to what we're doing. I think it was Greaves, who's a researcher from the UK, stated that resistance, full stop, is simply any mechanism which decreases the efficacy of a rodenticide program. That is the definition of resistance. So chemical resistance is where the chemicals become less effective. Behavioral resistance is when they just do weird things that decrease the efficacy of your program. So neophobia, behavioral resistance, a short-term one. So have you encountered this before? And I know you have.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, just an interesting thought that I was having is we've observed this over the last number of years. It really was like 2016, 17, 18, that kind of time frame where we really started to see behavioral. And I called it at the time, we weren't really saying around here, we weren't saying behavioral resistance. I was calling it habituated resistance. Like they out of habit were not doing the things that they were quote unquote supposed to do. You'd read the textbooks, and I came up through the 90s and early 2000s, and we were told house mice are curious, and you put the traps here, and they're going to run across it, and they're going to explore, and blah blah blah, and largely that was effective. And then as that changed, one of the things that we started to see was exactly what you're saying, where you would have a house mouse population that had no previous experience with
The thunder's coming in, something rotten. I've just had to close all the windows. It's the rain. I'm getting wet sat at my desk. Sorry.
Oh my gosh.
It's coming in that bad. So if I vanish, it's because I've been struck by lightning.
Okay.
Sorry,
That's
so I
okay.
apologize.
So,
I've just completely ruined your flow.
No, that's okay. So what we would start to see would be house mice that would be born and never have personal experience with a device or piece of equipment, but would have already behavioral resistance to that piece of equipment. And what we started to really think is, to me, that kind of lends towards some sort of genetic carrier or some sort of like bred carrier. And the only thing when I was working with our staff at the time, as we were trying to come up with solutions to, we still have to get rid of the mice somehow, is I was explaining it to them, and I'll run this by you, see what you think, is that it's, I see it as similar to how you breed certain characteristics into a dog, and you'll selectively breed a dog for certain things. It's going to be amiable and good with kids, or it's going to be a hunting dog and he's going to be high strung and whatever. And you can get those personality traits bred into a specific breed. It's not a different species. It's still dogs are dogs, right? But you have different breeds that will tend to have different personalities. And what I thought was, are we selectively harvesting and thereby breeding a certain personality type, a breed of house mouse that is resistant?
Yes. We're killing the dumb ones. That is the long and the short of it. I mean, it's the easiest way to describe it, isn't it? Because as you said before, in the conventional wisdom, house mice are curious. And if 9 out of 10 house mice are curious, and they're the ones you catch on the traps, which ones are you left behind with? The ones who have an innate distrust for everything. And it's the nature versus nurture argument. What is behavior? What drives behavior? It is an element of your genetics. It's also an element of your upbringing. But with that, genetics are carried on by generation. So if you are picking animals that have a genetic or an epigenetic trait for caution, of which over many generations arguably can breed caution into an animal, the same way as you can breed docility into an animal, or you can breed aggression into an animal. Arguably you should be able to breed caution into an animal by knocking off all those that are not cautious. Then we are selectively breeding for those animals which are predisposed to caution. Now with that, it might not necessarily be that we are selecting animals that are not going to engage with snap traps. We're breeding animals that are just not going to engage with anything, full stop. That's a more sort of like global resistance, let's say.
And something we've actually noticed when we've run into situations where we know we have behavioral resistance in a certain population. It's not everywhere, and it's not necessarily all the time. We have a game cam video where we'll see these house mice doing really strange things where they're not quote unquote supposed to be doing. They're not running along walls. They're not so that they can feel their hairs brush up against on one side. They're tearing off out in the middle of a warehouse. Just boom, straight out. And I imagine they're using still their kinesthetic senses to know how far to go and turn and whatever, but they're not doing what they would normally be doing. And as soon as we started seeing this video return, we're going, oh my goodness. So like the stuff we've done for 30 years we got to do something different.
Well, that's it. And if you think about it, so a rural mouse, probably much more likely to still hug walls and floor junctions. It's going to be exhibiting those thigmophilic responses because Out in the rurals, what's going to be the biggest predator? What's going to be the biggest driver of fear in a mouse? It's going to be cats, it's going to be owls, it's going to be predators. And having your back up against a wall, quite literally, will allow you that element of security. If you're a mouse in an urban environment where you do not have the risk of predation from owls or other animals, your biggest risk is every time you run along a Wallfloor Junction, that's where the traps live. Yeah, the ones that go beaming across the center of the room to survive. You know, it is a selectively bred trait, absolutely.
For
But
sure.
it's interesting that you say generationally, because there's a huge amount of research done on communication between individuals in rodent populations, and not only between individuals, but between parents and offspring. Have you heard this? It's all to do with the proteins in saliva, milk, and urine.
Yeah, and they'll communicate through that. Yeah, and the young will learn from mom. Oh, we're supposed to kind of eat these things, and we're that sort of
Yeah. So there's one amazing study that was done where they took mama rat in a cage, and she'd just given birth to a whole load of pups, and they offered her two foods: food A, food B. Food A was prime cut, corn, and the other one was corn that was allowed to have gone a bit moldy and a bit nasty. And of course, mum disappears off, tries some from column A, tries some from column B, decides that column A is where I'm going to be at, and so feeds exclusively forevermore in her habitual way on that. But as she is feeding on that, she's also weaning her pups. So there is proteins and pheromones in her milk, which says mum's happy, healthy, and boisterous. And then there is chemical cues in her saliva, which she's using to groom those animals, and that those pups are sensing and smelling on her breath and on her saliva, saying, right, corn is good, mum is happy, mum is healthy, eat corn. So when they took those pups away, just before those pups weaned, they took them all away before they had a chance to feed themselves, and they put them into another enclosure. They put them into another enclosure where they offered them a choice from meal A, meal B, and then also completely different meal C. Let's just call it wheat. Now, without fail, every single one of those pups went for food A. Despite the fact that they'd never eaten any of those before, you'd imagine 10 pups would have chosen at random one of those three options. Nope, every single one of them went for meal A. Now, eventually, they chose B and C out of curiosity, but the first meal, without fail, A, because they can communicate what is good. It's one of the reasons things like, and talking about bait selection, it's why things like the acute baits don't work as well as the chronic baits. So the chronic baits being the escars and the calciferols, things that take between 3 to 5 days to actually exhibit a physiological effect. Anything that works within a day, and realistically anything that works within an 8-hour window, that animal is able to rationalize the thing that I ate and the terrible thing that I am now experiencing. And not only are they able to rationalize that that was the thing that made me unwell, but they will create stress proteins, they'll create stress pheromones, they'll create, chemical compounds on their saliva. So as I said before, Barry's on the floor doing cartwheels, screaming like he's on fire. What did Barry eat? The blue stuff. Let's keep the hell away from that. And that's why classically things like the older poisons that we used, the phosphines and the rest of it. So not phosphine as a gaseous compound, but phosphine like zinc phosphide. 60% control as an average, 80% at a maximum, unless you're pre-baited and you basically pre-qualified that food as safe. So that's a form of behavioral resistance, and that's a learned resistance, and that can either be learned from personal experience or learned from shared experience, so a communal sharing of that. And that's a really classic form. We call that like bait aversion, which is a form of behavioral resistance.
So that plays into bait rejection, right? If that bait doesn't have enough time where it's accepted by the parents and brought home on their breath and on they smell like that, and the young learn, hey, yeah, that's what we're going to go eat. That can speed that rejection of that bait.
Yes, absolutely. And so, I mean, the best way I can think of describing this in terms, because we always say, I don't know if you say it in out in the States, but in the UK, we have this expression, think like a rat. Think like a rat. And it's one of those things we say, and it's one of these tired old think like a rat. But what does think like a rat actually mean? Because they're such a worlds apart in terms of what they do. But with that, we've got to understand that they're driven by a hierarchy. Number one, they're driven by their sense of smell and sense of taste. And to put this into some context, into ways that we can understand, can you tell me the best food you've ever eaten in your life, the best meal you've ever had? Tell me the best dessert you've ever eaten. Oh, just right now on the fly.
My wife's creme brulee.
Oh, that's a diplomatic answer if ever there was one.
No, she doesn't. She's good. She's good. She does a good. She doesn't listen to this anyway, so it doesn't. I'm not getting any brownie points.
Well, tell me on the flip side of that, when the last time you had food poisoning was, and what was it?
Oh my goodness, I can't even remember. I'm pretty
Okay.
food careful, but yes, it's been a while.
You are breaking the mold here.
I
Usually,
know.
when I do this, I'll talk people. They'll say, "Right, I ate a chicken korma
Yeah,
15 years ago in Malta, and I felt like I was turning inside out. And I can remember the shoes I was wearing, and the
right.
haircut I had at the time. It's because all life on Earth is predisposed at a genetic level to survive, and the things that taste good are great. The things that taste bad will kill you. And so the things that make you unwell, you're hardwired. And this is all animals on life. All animals on Earth are hardwired to focus on the negative, bad news cells. Bad news is dangerous, okay? And with that, we are predisposed to focusing on the things that can do us danger. And that pretty much is the driving force behind behavioral resistance, full stop, because we are hardwired. Rats are hardwired, mice are hardwired, budgerigars are hardwired to avoid negative stimuli. And if you experience a negative stimulus once, it has significantly more impact on your behavior than experiencing a positive stimulus several times. Because
Sure.
the positive stimulus is great, the negative stimulus will kill you.
Sure.
The red berries make me feel unwell, but the blueberries are fine. Which am I going to make sure I'm looking out for in the woods? The red ones,
Sure.
because they're the ones that will hurt me.
So the active has a role in that, and then the formulation they're going to connect to those negative consequences.
Theoretically, the formulation has all of the part to play with this. The active materials, especially in escars, at the levels with which we use them, are almost untastable by rodents.
Right.
There's a bit of research out there that says diphenocum above a certain parts per million will be tasted, but it's a parts per million that is not actually used by any formulation around the world. So with that, they can't taste any of the 5 escars.
Sure.
So it's entirely the formulation that you are thinking. So with bait aversion and bait rejection, the key is not to swap between active materials as you would do with traditional resistance. They're eating this red block, whatever manufacturer might be making red blocks. So I'm going to swap to the blue block, which is the same formulation but a different active material. Conventional resistance, that's exactly what you do. But with behavioral resistance, absolutely not. You swap from the blue block to the blue paste or the blue grain or the blue gel, whatever formulations you might have there, because it's the formulation that they're associating danger with, not the active material. And realistically speaking, there we go. So it's as you say, it's the association really of all of those things. There is the association of the taste, the smell, the odors, all of those things.
And we've seen this where we had some instances where we had ran into like a true metabolic resistance to an active ingredient, and in switching over to a alternative active, we were able to get a modicum of control. Unfortunately, it was a bait that acted far too fast, and they started to associate that bait with a problem. Now, here's where it got interesting: is when we went, okay, this isn't working here. We switched to a third active, which was a little bit longer acting. We left some of, and this was by happenstance that this happened. It was by accident. Some of the bait that they had started to completely reject stayed in stations and was added with the new bait as well. So we had 2 baits in a station, one of one kind that they had previously rejected, one of a new formulation, different active ingredient and formulation. in every station where both of those were present, there was no feeding on any bait at all. They wouldn't touch any of it. In
The
every
association with the whole
with the whole
box.
thing, the every station that had been cleaned out completely and put the new bait that they had no association with any negative consequences had feeding. So we found them not even entering the stations where the bait that they had a negative association with. They could smell it in there. They wouldn't even enter the station. Like this is a no go.
Yeah. That's
Yep.
amazing. I love these real world instances, because it's all well and good saying, oh, I read a study by Webster, I read a study by, Greaves, by Buckle, by Meehan, by all of these sort of like folks who have done a huge amount of research, but actually seeing it in the field, there's no comparison, is there, at the end of the day?
No, for
No.
sure, for sure.
So do you guys use what we would call in the UK and Europe monitoring baits, non-toxic preparations?
We do, and it's funny. I've had mixed results because what we've found is that some of the monitoring baits, we still end up deploying them inside of a bait station, and in the situations where we've really needed them, the bait stations themselves were non grata with the with the rodents. So we couldn't get in a lot of situations we couldn't get feeding on the monitoring blocks because they were in a station that previously the mice have decided they're not entering at all.
So that's another type of behavioral resistance that we'll talk about in a bit, because that's not a resistance to the formulations.
Right.
That's a resistance to the sundries, the equipment. But to go back to monitors, because monitors are a phenomenal tool, and in my opinion, they are misused and abused and kicked from pillar to post and blamed for all kinds of things. When in reality, I honestly think that they are probably one of the most underused tools in our arsenal, and they can have such an impact on what we do.
Sure.
It's silly at the end of the day, because number one, there's the whole environmental security argument, isn't there? You can either leave a rodenticide in a box 365 days a year, and you're going to catch a rat, but also what else are you going to catch? The risks increase. It's like that line. I don't know if you've ever watched Fight Club, but there's one line from Ed Norton where he says, on a long enough time span, the likelihood of survival for anyone will ultimately drop to zero. It's this statistical line. If you leave bait down 365 days of the year, the statistical likelihood of something other than a rat eventually encountering and engaging with that will always become one. It will become, a certainty. So using things like non-toxic monitors, number one, they decrease that, they decrease that time period significantly because it reduces the risks. Number two, you get to see what animals are going in there. Is it a rat or a mouse, a vole, a pigeon, anything like that? But finally, and this is where people misuse them, is it pre-qualifies your treatment to that animal. It lets that animal know that the food in there is safe, that the food in there is there. So if you have a monitoring block, which is the same size, shape, taste as your active material,
Sure.
that when that rat or that mouse comes along, it instantly will engage from one to the other. You just take the monitor out, you put the real stuff in, that rat has no idea that there's been any change whatsoever. And then suddenly, engagement, not just engagement with that one animal, it's not that one animal coming in, taking a bit, going away, seeing how it feels 24 hours later, disseminating that information to its buddies. No, it and its buddies have actually been happily chowing down on that. New stuff's turned up. Everyone engages on day 0. By day 3 to 5, everybody's doing the whole blue parrot dance, aren't they? So it's a phenomenal tool to increase engagement, to reduce neophobia, to get around all of these issues. And not only that, it's just cool.
Yeah, no, it totally is. The ones with the biomarkers are the coolest. You got the black light, luminescent type droppings and stuff. That's awesome. I love that stuff. One of the problems we've run into, and like I was saying, with some of these like monitoring blocks and things like that, is what we've started to actually call site abuse. So in these places that have had chronic pest control being administered for a long period of time, we've started to call it site abuse, because what we'll find is we will find every manner of station and trap littered around places, in drop ceilings and in warehouses and all over the place, and they're not being maintained. And what will end up, why we're getting called in, is that you're having difficulty controlling the problem. And when you walk into this, you're finding, oh my gosh, they've been educated on everything. Like, you'll have 4 different companies stations in some of these, and every brand, every style, and they're like the most educated mice you've ever seen. So
They've
we had
encountered it all.
so we'd had to be creative with some of the ways we address it, and we'll talk about that towards the end. But I wanted to move on to some of the equipment rejection. So materials, because that's the first thing that people like. We have some of these traps, like this is like a Victor style, snap trap like this. You got the classic wooden. So if mice have, this one's a rat one, obviously not a mouse trap, but and then some of the plastic stations, some of the one-off little, smaller stations. Have you been finding that the materials would be associated? So they'll be like, I'm not going near something plastic. I'm not going something near wood. I'm not metal. What's your thoughts on that?
Generally speaking, plastic seems to be the big avoider. Wood, not so much, because wood tends to take on the smells of the environment. So unless something has died horribly and then turned to that, that soup that, as pest managers the world over, we understand rat soup probably better than anyone. And if you have that on a wooden trap, I would probably argue it's not going to be as effective anymore, simply because would you go into a room that smelt of dead bodies? The answer is probably no. So same thing. But plastic, absolutely, because plastic has such a specific, it's such an artificial smell. It's such a smell associated with human activity that, yes. And largely that probably what happens is, you encounter, so there was this phenomenal, I'll keep going back to studies, but I'm sorry. This study done in the UK by this lady, Sandra Baker. And it was not done for the benefit of the pest management community. It was done to poke holes at it, but it actually elucidated some very interesting bits of information, which was she took a whole load of breakback traps off the internet, went to eBay, Amazon, Google, bought 30 or so breakback traps, and then put a strain gauge in them and measured 2 variables. Number one, the impact force in newtons, and then the clamping force in newtons. So, the power in which it knocked something on the noggin, and then the strength at which it held it there. And it found overwhelmingly that a lot of the traps that were bought, I would say knockoff traps, but the cheaper traps that you bought, which obviously were not of high enough quality, some of the rat traps in that experiment had a lower impact and clamping force than some of the mouse traps.
Wow.
Yeah. At that point, you've got a rat basically running around with a little party hat on, letting everyone know. But it's instances like that: foul catches, miscatches, bad traps that have been set and left too long, where the springs have then degraded.
So
all of
is that like that's like a sublethal exposure? Like when you think exactly insecticide resistance, you get a sublethal exposure, a certain percentage survive. They get knocked by a station that doesn't kill them. They pull off a glue board, whatever. They go along their merry way. Yeah.
Okay. And not only that, they tell everyone else about it as well through these communication channels mentioned before. The other one is if you have something that has a weak impact force but a high clamping force, you've got an animal that's not immediately going to perish, and it's going to be urinating everywhere. It's going to emptying its bladder. Within its bladder is going to be all of these stress proteins and stress pheromones. It's going to coat that trap in that. So the next mouse or the next rat that comes along says, right, plastic trap, tragic death. And the assumption, the sort of like insinuation, what's the word I'm looking for, association between the two is instantly made there. So I think we kind of, as a community, as a society, as the human race, we wildly underestimate rats. And people always look at me funny when I talk so passionately about how amazing rats are, and they're like, what do you do for a living? Oh, yeah, well, I find ways to kill them. But they are such a wonderful adversary, because if it was that easy, we would have been out of the job years ago.